Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Company Road podcast. When we think of entrepreneurship, it conjures up different images to different people. Some of aspiring leaders, I think, some of established leaders, seasoned or starting out. Sometimes we think of enormous, unprecedented accomplishments, but often it's the quiet successes that go largely unnoticed. It could be the plucky underdog who's chipping away at something magic in the background. But I want to introduce you to Brendan here, Brendan Donoghue, who's someone I'm sure is no stranger to those feelings or experiences. Brendan, you're a bit of a figurehead in the world of design and customer experience, and I've seen you talk at many a conference and do a podcast or two along the way as well, so you're pretty seasoned at this stuff. You're a head of digital and customer experience at UniSuper currently, where you've been for a few years. In your past, you've been at NAB, head of digital design, also at Telstra as a GM in the area of advocacy and engagement. So you're in a strong leadership position. I'm really looking forward to the conversation that we have today. For the fact that you're a leader in design now, but also you've enjoyed huge successes along the way. But maybe we'll get into some of the other side of it as well. You know, what happened around the background of those successes to make those things possible. But let's get to know you a bit better to begin with.
Good morning, Chris, and thank you very much for the introduction. It's been a really wonderful career, but I think one of the things that I always loved was early on in my career was the opportunities that people took to give me guidance. And so I love coming along and speaking at conferences, being a part of these things, because I think it's an opportunity to give back. I think it's something really special and unique about the design community that I love being a part of.
Yeah, brilliant. Thanks, Brendan. And let's start us off with a bit of a question around what characterizes you. I've heard you talk about this in various ways, but I'd love to hear your answer on that today. Maybe it's shifted on, maybe it hasn't. Let's hear about what characterizes you.
What characterizes me? I think if you asked me what's my approach in a single word, I'd go back to, we were doing a piece of work at NAB Labs many years ago, and we were trying to work out what was the unique characteristic that set aside a successful designer within a complex organization above all others. And is it craft excellence? Is it skill? Is it communication, which was quite popular? But ultimately where I landed was, I think it is relentlessness. And what that means is inside really complex organizations, especially corporate institutions, you are dealing with very staid and fixed ways of working, people that have built careers around doing things in a particular way. And as designers, we are confronting and challenging for those individuals and those processes. So if you're coming into these organizations and you're saying, hey, there's actually a different way that we could be doing this, you have to have this sense of resilience and to be able to push through. So this is where I think about the thing that sets me apart, or the thing that I think I champion the most, is this relentless pursuit of doing things in a better way. And it's not just resilience, but it's the ability to keep pushing through those roadblocks. It doesn't mean pushing into things where you're not wanted. You've got to read the room. You've got to look for your opportunities, but it just means don't give up. Always keep pushing forward and always keep looking for those changes, because sometimes it's about having the answer when the question's asked. So when the opportunity comes up, you can jump in and you can look after it. But if you're not constantly pushing, maybe the opportunity passes you by when you're not ready for it.
Yeah, I'm wondering that, because relentlessness brings with it some degree of baggage in that it isn't always expected that your resilience, that your push is going to continue. Some people within your organization are going to fight against that. So how do you get around that resistance and that friction and that pain in the backside that could be construed or taken the wrong way, but you're just trying to push for the same outcome? How do you manage some of those things?
I think it comes down to influence. So I've often thought about, early on in my career, I'd been fascinated by this idea of design thinking and the human-centered approach. It enabled us to understand what the member was thinking, what the user was thinking. And so it was all about, we found this secret key to tell us that we were right. And all I had to do was explain to the business, ta-da, look, I've got the thing, here's the thing. And in my career, I've delivered really big pieces of work and some transformative change, and then I've been made redundant. I've struggled with that early on in my career, where I was like, hang on a second, how do we do this? At Telstra, I delivered massive change. We fixed mobile billing, removed proration, the number one pain point for new members, massive drop in calls, drop in credits, big rise in NPS, and I was made redundant within a few months. How did that happen? How did these two things happen? And basically what I'd done was I'd been too focused on being right and not focused on actually taking people on the journey. I'd managed to alienate my leadership because I hadn't listened to what they wanted, and they actually had ideas, they had suggestions on what to do. But instead of listening to that and translating it back into things that made sense for them, I was too fixated on, no, listen, I've got this is the answer, and I pushed forward. So really fixate on what's the thing that you need to do if you want to transform an organization or change an organization. Don't focus on being right. Being right's almost irrelevant. you've got to build influence. And to build influence as a creative and a creative leader, you've got to really understand, how does the organization think and feel? Like, what is your boss's KRAs? What's your boss's KRAs? What are the company scorecard items? As a designer, you have to be able to translate the value of your work into those outcomes. So as a designer, a design leader, I don't tend to talk about things in relation to member experience and how members are feeling, except for when they translate into, it'll increase sales, it'll reduce churn. Sometimes as designers, I think that we tell ourselves the myth that we exist within enterprises, corporate institutions, because they're good corporate citizens. It's just not true. People care about customers because there is a financial outcome, increase in sales, decrease in cost to serve, decrease in churn. Design thinking, human-centered design are tools that enable us to actually get to those outcomes. So there's an opportunity for us to actually translate that value. So when I'm thinking about building influence, it's always about being able to talk about our work in a way that makes sense for the organization.
What are some of the big differences? It could be in language or a situation where that hasn't worked out. It's like you're pressing all the buttons and nothing's happening. Does that happen from time to time?
Look, in my career, I've been fascinated by this idea of, where are the design leaders? So John Cole co-wrote Design Thinking's Time Has Arrived, or The Time of Design Thinking Is Here, or something, in about 2015. And it was published in the Harvard Business Review. And I remember reading it at the time and thinking, this is it. Our moment's here. Chief design officers are around the corner. Everyone's going to come to us and they're going to listen to what we're thinking. And we waited, and here we are in 2023, and they're not here. The chief design officer role, it's been given to a couple of individuals, but they're not C-suite executives like CTOs and CIOs. They're within organizational structures. As someone had said to me once, if a chief design officer is real, could they become CEO? If you can't take that next step to CEO, then it's probably not a chief role. It's more window dressing. So how do we actually build influence within these organizations? And I became fixated on the idea, and I really looked into this. I even did it as part of my master's. So I've come up with an idea that basically what you've got to be doing is, if you want to be an influential design leader, you've got to have 4 things within your toolkit. You've got to have craft excellence, to be really good at the thing that you're doing, because that's the foundation for the work that you're doing. You've got to be an excellent design leader. You've got to be a good design leader if you want to bring people with you. There's no point doing the work if people aren't following you. 3, and we talked about this a little bit just before, have a really strong business acumen. So be able to understand and translate your work into, or the value of your work into, the value that the organization understands. But here's the last one. It's the most important one. You've got to take risk. If you're not embracing risk and engaging in what I'd termed entrepreneurial behaviors, but I think you might term being an entrepreneur, you're going to miss the opportunity. So I've run into scenarios throughout my career where we were doing all the right stuff, but I had product owners who wouldn't listen to me. And I'll give you a really good one. So I was working at a bank. I won't name, but we were working at a big bank, and we really had a way to improve the online experience that we were giving to our members. But I had a product owner that just wasn't listening to us. And we knew that we had a GM who would take a meeting each Tuesday, and they would come up the lift and they'd walk from the meeting at 11 o'clock and they'd walk across to their desk. So what we did was we went and did the design work. We printed it out. We put it on big A3 pieces of paper, and we put it in the kitchen, which sat between the lift and the desk. So when they came out of the lift, they walked through and we said, "Oh, g'day, how are you?" And she said, "Oh, Brendan, what are you doing here?" And we said, "Oh, we just needed some space. So we've actually put all of these designs out on the table here and having a look. Can I take a look?" "Sure." She has a look and she said, "These look fantastic. Like, this is amazing. What do you need here?" And we said, "Oh, we just taken a crack at how we could improve the online experience. How much money do you need to do this work? This is how much we need. I'll fund it straight away. Let's get going." So it's that even when you've got the right idea and even when you can translate the value, sometimes you've got to do something a little bit different so that people will listen to you.
Do you think there's a training ground for that? I mean, where do you learn how to do this? I don't know if it's an ambush, but it's kind of like sometimes you need to use a bit of that guerrilla behavior to get the point made and cut across some of the usual flow of business in a day-to-day environment. What's been good in helping advise what's safe and what's unsafe?
It's a really good question. I think you've got to just start small and you've got to find what works. I think for me, I've got all of these different stories of me pushing against the grain. But the thing that's worked for me is I did it in an authentic way. I did it in my way. I think if someone else tried exactly the same things, it might come off a little bit differently. So I would suggest if you're moving into the space, start small, start agitating around small things. But I often talk to my team about the back pocket design. And the back pocket design is the design we carry around in our back pocket. So when someone says, "Oh, wonder if we could do this differently. You whip it out, you say, here, we've already thought about this. So it's about sharpening what you're doing by constantly looking for things that we could improve and pushing into those areas, maybe before you've got permission to do it, and really agitate them for that change. And all you have to do is show how to do one thing better. And then the business is more likely to come to you again and again. I think sometimes as designers, we fall into this trap of thinking, and particularly in corporates where I've crafted my career, not everywhere is an agency. And so not everywhere needs to stand still and wait for the brief. But when you're a part of that big unit, actually look for the opportunities to drive forward and push the organization in a proactive sense, as opposed to waiting to find out what we should be doing.
There's definitely a permission culture that sits around corporate structure, and you've worked in very complex organizations. And I'm wondering how you go about getting to know that structure and them getting to know you to the extent that they would trust you if you pull the design out of the back pocket, or if you interrupt them after the lift exit on the way back from a coffee. How does that relational aspect evolve into something that is much more founded on trust, and it's accepting of you as a leader or as somebody with a point of view at that moment?
You have to start with relationships. Every organization that I've gone to, I really eat my own cake in relation to design. So every time I arrive at a new organization, the very first thing I'm doing is sitting down. I'm doing lots of interviews, meets and greets, however you want to frame it when you're setting the Outlook Teams invite up. But lots of conversations. You're understanding who are the people within the organization that support you, who don't support you, understand the opportunity that you've got to drive change, the space that you should be in, and then work out what does the organization really need you to be doing? Because there's always a difference between what those hiring you think need to be done and sometimes what really needs to be done, because there's all these hidden elements, there's personal bias, there's unknowns. And actually coming in and doing that design, especially when you're building a new team. At UniSuper, I came into the organization and I built that CX team and really followed that approach. Whenever I've come a cropper in my career, it is when I haven't followed that approach and I've come in and just assumed I can move forward at pace. And that's when you end up leaving people behind, because you haven't taken the time to understand, A, what's the space you've got to play in, and what's the opportunity you can be going after, but also building those relationships. The relationships sit at the core. Like I said, being right isn't enough. It's actually about how do you deliver the change and how do you bring the people on side?
Yeah, and I think, like you say, you bring your own personal brand to that mix, and all of a sudden people remember you for that. The engagement with you as opposed to anybody else becomes something that is more memorable through a conversation or through any of the stunts that you've tried. Are there any other big stories you want to tell around that before we move on? Just around a stunt or something that you felt really helped build a relationship in an unexpected way?
Oh, it's funny you call them stunts, because for me, they're just it's an organic way of working. I've come through a number of teams that were made redundant after delivering great value. And you really have to think about what was going wrong in those teams. So I've come to the opinion that design has to be tied to delivery. And that's the way in which the organization sees the value of design. So when I started at UniSuper, I immediately went to the guy at the time was the head of digital. And I said, I need to come and sit on your floor because you and I have to be joined at the hip. And he laughed at me and said, oh, Brendan, if you want to come and sit on this floor, you'd literally have to bring your own desk. There's no room for you here. And on a Friday night, I then loaded 2 desks into the goods lift and brought them up. And come Monday morning, here I am sitting on the floor with the only UX designer that I'd hired to that point. And we're like, g'day, welcome, we're here. We've wired everything up. And it disrupted and it caused a lot of angst. But it was one of these things that once we'd done it, they couldn't undo it. And so it went from being a sense of mirth and maybe annoyance at the start to within a couple of weeks, we were just embedded. We were part of the conversations. It was a lot easier to include us in form design or login or flow or whatever because we were right there. So I think the thing about stunts or disruptions is you've got to push into these hard spaces if you want to be taken seriously. Otherwise, we could have sat down on a completely different floor and spent 6 months wondering why we weren't being listened to.
Yeah, no, I love it. I mean, that's just a genius way of getting the message across. In the spatial environment, that can make a big difference. It reminds me of that scene in The Twits in the book by Roald Dahl where they come back and all the furniture's on the ceiling, and it's not quite that, but it's that kind of...
I think I have that book in my bookcase back here.
Yeah, got to sit up and pay attention. Something's different about the world of work. I can't figure out what it is. Oh yeah, I can see Brendan and his team sitting in the corner there now. It's brilliant. There's something to be said for some of those public and very open interactions. I won't use this word stunts anymore, but more about the interactions and the things that you can enable through that. But when we've spoken in the past, there's a lot also to be said for the things that happen behind the scenes that you're somehow tinkering away at, and just in terms of what you make public and what you keep back and what you work on in your version of a corporate shed somewhere back there. What's worked for you there? And how have you known when to bring things to the fore and bring them out into the public domain?
It's a really good question. When I was at NAB, we had a challenge that we wanted to be solving around business banking. And the business banking experience was not where we wanted it to be. So we desperately wanted to improve it. And I'd been part of a group that were asking for additional funding, and it kept getting knocked back because rightly so, funding had been allocated and we should have worked out how to do it. But instead of just sitting there and saying, well, you know what, we had a crack and we can't improve it, let's go away, I came up with a way. My friend and co-collaborator, the head of tech at the time, we built a little group of individuals who sat in this tiny little corner office on one of those floors. And we spent about 10 weeks doing 100 rounds of customer interviews and 11 rounds of iterative design, and came up with a clickable prototype that showed what the future of business banking could be. And not a radical departure, but really just what if we got in and we updated the interactions, the patterns, the styles, and actually created an experience that was much more focused on the member and linked into some aspects of kind of emotional design as opposed to the standard business banking experience you get today. And what we had at the end was a really engaging, clickable prototype. We had a bunch of vox pops that we'd captured on video of customers saying things like, oh, if I saw this, I'd move over from the CommBank, and oh, this finally feels like my bank instead of someone else's. This is amazing. And we popped up at that point. We had no permission to do this. It was pretty questionable whether or not we wouldn't have gotten into trouble if it hadn't worked out. But we had no permission to do this, went away and did this work, and we popped up at the end with this clickable prototype. And we were funded within about 48 hours. Because what happened was, as soon as we started to show this to senior stakeholders, the question shifted from, can we get some money to go and do something, to this is what we want to build. Can we please go and build this? And it shifted radically because what happened was senior stakeholders in the organization understood what we wanted to do, understood what the end state could be, and were clamoring to get involved because they knew, hey, this is exactly what our CEO is talking about in building the bank of the future. I want to be on this. So we went from working in the shadows and being very quiet about what we were doing to within about 2 weeks, the CEO was asking for weekly updates on the work that we were doing. So I think the question there about when do you pop up and show what you're doing is number one, you've got to be comfortable to go and take the risk and do the work that maybe you don't have the permission to do. So within your leadership of the team, find time to go and work on those things that maybe aren't being the priority from the business, or understand what the overall priorities are and find the time to do those. And then number two, work out how to communicate them back to the business. For us, clickable prototypes are worth their weight in gold, because up to that point, I could talk about things until the cows come home. But as soon as I can get a stakeholder who can click around something, it feels real for them. I almost have this thing, if I prototype it, the chance of it getting built is so much higher than if I've just got even screens on a piece of paper, because it starts to make things real for stakeholders and they can get behind the idea, or alternatively, they can tell you why it won't work and why they'd like to go in a different direction. But now you've got them engaged in the process.
The conversations that happen obviously around whether something should be stood up as a work stream are very different to those where you've got actually something to show. You see this in the startup world all the time, where actually it's not just the fact that you've got a great idea and you've been able to put an excellent pitch deck together, but if you can show that people are actually interacting with it, buying it, you've got the numbers, the data to show. I guess the more you can show, the more convincing the argument really. And the easier it is, talking to motivation and ease, the easier it is for somebody to actually come on board and say, okay, well, if all you need is money, then we'll take it to the next stage. But I think it's also an interesting point in its origination of the seed of an idea, in whichever way that is planted and whichever way it comes about, has to start with somebody. And somebody, through a team structure or individually, has to either make a conscious decision to take their time away from something that somebody else that's probably at a quite senior level is already expecting them to do, and go sideways, left and right, and then somehow come up with this new set of thinking. So I'm wondering how that process works for you in teams that you've seen, and how it works well, because is it somebody in your team coming to you one day and saying, I need your approval to do this? Are they just going off and doing it? What's the best way of getting some of that traction really happening?
I think it really comes down to the environment that you're in. I'm really influenced by, I don't know if you've ever seen the book Trojan Horse and Dark Matter by Dan Hill, but a really amazing concept of talking about how you can really change big organizations through small changes. And to paraphrase, and probably paraphrase quite badly, They wanted to build a wooden building a few stories high within a European country. And all the regulations at the time said you couldn't possibly do it. But from a sustainability standpoint, from a building structure standpoint, quality of material, this was an excellent idea. So instead of doing the old idea, which is coming in and making this big case to change the rules so that they could build the thing, they just said, could we actually just get permission to do this very small thing? And people said, yeah, of course you can do that small thing. That's not a problem. And then they delivered the small thing. And then all of a sudden, everyone else was saying, well, look at this as an excellent example of something working well. Let's build more. Let's change the regulations. So then the argument is being made outside of that team. The argument's being made by the people in the public square. So when I think about creating that space for design to exist, do small things exceptionally well. And that creates the opportunity then for you to be doing more and more. If you start by just doing the work that's asked of you and not pushing it and doing something else, don't start by swinging for the bleachers, right? Start with something really small. Start with something that's just taking a few days and popping up. We had a great one we'd done at NAB, which was sharing receipts. So when you'd finished a transaction, did you wish to share the receipt with someone? Yeah, I wish to share the receipt. So we'd gone and done that work. We had that there. We knew what the design was looking like. And then one day, one of the team said, look, we've run out of story points before the sprint's over. Is there anything we should do? Here's an idea. This is a great idea. And it ended up being one of the best features that had come out in that kind of quarter. So it's about starting small. And the more and more you do it, the more the business accepts that's what you do. And you can create the space then to continue to do that. So my counsel would be, you've got to create it by just warming the frog up, right? Or boiling the frog. There's not a PC term for that. I wish I could think of one, but 1 degree at a time so that it doesn't shock the business, but it actually just gets them used to the idea of you'll always take this time to be looking at things that could be improving.
I mean, that's a great point. I think around, it's a parallel point and maybe a stretch into the discussion that we could have around risk and in terms of what makes risk comfortable, because risk is an inevitability within everyday business. So we're always having, I guess, quite combative discussions, heated discussions with certain key members and leadership members who just don't see a way to accept the idea without the interrogation that goes with it. So you're always coming up against the barriers that you have to overcome. So keeping it small obviously minimizes that. But do you have any other points of view around risk and how to best manage that?
Oh, I think as a design leader, you have to embrace risk. You've got to be really comfortable with it. I watched it at Telstra, Optus before that, and the National Australia Bank. Really good design ideas or really good design processes get passed over and confident product owners listened to in the alternative. And the reason for that is because often as designers, what we do is we turn up and someone will say, we want to grow the business by X%. And we say, right, what we need is 6 months and we'll go and do this piece of research, then we'll do this iteration and then we'll do something. And then when we get to the end, maybe we'll have an answer. And that's very uncomfortable for those leaders within the business. A product owner will turn up and say, I'll do it, give me the money. But if you actually take that view and you say, look, I will deliver this element of growth, and then you really focus on that outcome during your design process, you are more likely to get to that than you are not. Like if you don't believe in design, why should the rest of the business? So when I talk about risk, it's that idea of saying, commit to the outcome, focus on the outcome as you're doing the design, and then actually drive to that outcome throughout all of your process and use it as a measure, use it as the guideline to stay on track for what you're doing. I think as designers, sometimes we can focus on the process and get process-orientated outcomes, which is, well, we'll get to the end and what we get is what we get, as opposed to saying what we need to get at the end is this, how are we measuring every step along the way to make sure that's where we're going?
Yeah, it's a great point around the process versus the outcome. I often think that the process, particularly when, like you say, when there is uncertainty, it's the bit that gets wheeled out because everyone understands that this is how the process goes. And you've got Double Diamond and people jump in, they understand, okay, the team's going to be involved in these exercises through your discovery. But actually, the underlying thread that is often omitted from that discussion is around value that you're really aiming to extract from that process. And actually, if it was more orientated around the outcome and selling the outcome rather than the process, then the outcome would justify the investment and much more, I'm sure. The participation, the acceptance, the apathy, you'd get over that as well. You know, it just feels like it would be an easier conversation. But actually framing the outcome for a lot of people is terrifying. I think putting yourself on the line and saying, like you were saying about the product owner just there, I'll come and do it, give me the money. Not everyone feels comfortable doing that. What would be your advice in that space?
It's a really difficult one. And this is where I think sometimes as a design leader within the community, I'm somewhat of a heretic because I'm actually saying that if I reflect on that earlier point about where are the design leaders? Part of the reason that I think we haven't had greater success is because we thought that the entire business world was going to change around us. And actually, what's needed to happen is we have to change around it. So this idea that you can always focus on just the process and trust me, I'll get to the outcome. It doesn't work for those who are used to making decisions in a particular way, having confidence around the outcomes that they'll get from the investments that they'll make, the business case process, the return on investment, all of these measures that organizations use to guide investment. We've got to actually make those work for us. So leaning into and taking that risk, I think that's something we have to just get more comfortable with. And here's the thing, if you actually lean into those and you're in control of the work that you're doing, you have to be able to back yourself at least at some level to get to that outcome. I think we're at our least efficient when someone else is driving everything that we're doing. And that's a situation you can wind up in when you don't have the confidence to say, yes, I can actually do this and get entrusted to deliver the work, but someone else does. And then all of a sudden you've got a non-designer running the design activities. So I think as design leaders, it's something, and once again, start small. Start small, build up that confidence, and then lean into it. But once you get going, you'll be able to actually understand where your project's going off track or where your work's going off track and where it's not, and how you can bring it in and still deliver on those outcomes.
Yeah, and I think that often the value of the design is almost judged for the design that is created at that level. It could be aesthetic, it could be from an experience design point of view. What is the utility that you're driving? It can be some of that, I guess, more subjective, interpretive realm of, okay, well, I like the thing you've done there because it looks like we can put it on the poster and it can sit outside the lift. And yeah, we can talk about it for a little while. But actually, what sits beneath, what does it achieve, not only for it being in itself, but also for the business, for the team that you've worked with, for the individuals that have worked with that? I think you can start to extract stories around value from lots of different places. Do you find that you draw from a really broad set of access points when you're thinking about what you can use to leverage what's being done and turn that into story that can be played back to business and leadership? And really, do you feel like you're sweating the assets in that sense and really kind of merchandising what's going on at deeper levels as well?
Absolutely. To answer the question, one thing that I tell a lot of junior designers is, as you're coming into the industry, the ability to tell your story and quantify the value of your work is critical. But really early on, it's going to be very hard to do, because a lot of times you'll say, listen, I think there's more value in doing this than this. And it's very easy for a senior stakeholder then and say, oh, look, you've been in this role for 5 minutes. What do you really know? So I often talk about anecdotes, the shortcut to wisdom. And it's essentially really early on in your career, soak yourself in the stories of other people. Understand, how did Instagram do something? How did Facebook do something? What was Apple's approach? What were the early frog designers doing when they were creating Apple's original design language? Get into all of this stuff and understand the rich history of where we've come from. So when you're faced with a difficult problem, and I had one of these a couple of years ago, we had a problem with a page taking too long to load the content on submit. And I said, oh, you know what Instagram actually did many years ago? Basically, when you'd load an image, you wanted to upload the photo and you add your tags and you would add your text, and then you'd click on submit, and it would take ages to actually upload into the cloud. People would drop out. Horrible experience. So they started, as you were creating the post, they started to upload the photo in the background. And then as it was uploading in the background and you're doing your hashtags and then your comments and you're clicking on submit, it's instant. You think, my gosh, this app is so fast. I used that as a story when I was trying to explain to people on how we could approach something differently. And it was no longer Brendan's idea. It was actually, hey, this is how $1 billion organization has actually approached this problem. What do you think? And guess what? People then will line up behind that because, oh, okay, well, if they've done it, it's a really good idea. We should do it too. So you end up getting the outcome and bringing the stakeholder on the journey, even though you might not personally have a lot of experience to back that up, but you know how others have approached that problem.
Yeah, I think it also stems from an understanding of innovation and what you can leverage at any given time, because if you're playing more in the incremental space, then that feels a little bit safer. Sometimes it's more radical, obviously, and then you're needing to bring out the justification and its entourage and its brass band that goes with it. And I think some of the case studies that you mentioned are really helpful. Finding a parallel industry, a use case, something that can really substantiate the direction of your thought. I'm also just thinking about other realms. I went to a talk. There was a strategy director that came over. He was working with Nike, Wyden and Kennedy, the agency that was doing a ton of really highly creative campaigns for a couple of decades or more. He was telling people about what was inspiring him and how to actually keep things fresh, and just that relentless origination of new and diverse thinking that was manifested in the ads that were created. And he was talking a lot to the outside influence, the things that you reach for that are just totally unrelated. I mean, a lot of people bring in military analogies and things that they've read about in fiction. There's obviously art and other cultural references that come in, but I think that there's something also to be said for the connection to other unrelated things. I personally, in the strategy work that I do, I get a lot from knowing a bit about music and how that's all put together, how to compose, how to write music, how people get inspiration from that, and what structures and frameworks sit around it, and rather than bringing that into design. But other people find that their muse comes from other areas too. Do you have something like that works for you?
I'm absolutely obsessed with those stories of success and leadership from outside of the realm of design. I love sporting analogies. I'm a bit of a tragic Geelong supporter and will often reference the 2007 Geelong Cats as a kind of this classic example of a team at the start of the season, very fits and starts. A couple of losses, couple of wins. The season before questioned whether or not they should sack their coach. I think it's about round 5 or round 6. The team gets together and makes the collective decision that they want to find out what it's like to be premiership players, that they're sick of being the bridesmaid and never the bride, and they're going to go for it. And they then progress through one of the greatest seasons from that point that the AFL's ever seen. And when you think about nothing changed in relation to the rules, nothing changed in relation to the competition, the ball's still the same shape, ground's still the same shape. What changed was the culture and the kind of leadership that existed within that group. And so whenever I'm looking, it's often coming into these teams, how can you be unlocking that latent potential? How can you be turning the group that you've got into absolute champions? And so I'm fascinated by that, because I think sometimes as design leaders, our job is to shape, mold, to grow, but sometimes our job's just to get out of the way. Like a great piece of design, make it a focus of the experience they're having as opposed to the thing that they're using. So for me, sporting analogies, business analogies, but even things outside of that, and always looking for opportunities to inspire, to build greater stories from across every realm of art and culture, I think are appropriate. Can I just add, it's actually something that we lean quite into at my work. Whenever I'm building a design team, something that I like to do is really lean into creative inspiration. I'm quite inspired by, I think it's Tim Brown's book, The Art of Innovation, and that you don't become innovative by doing the same thing again and again. You've actually got to be looking for inspiration outside of that realm. And so they often talked about whenever they were at IDEO and they wanted to be creating something, they would bring in a lot of physical things and play with them. They were designing a new tap at one point. So they went and bought every shower head and every tap they could possibly use and brought them all in and played with them for a couple of days before they actually got into their exercise. So one of the things we do, and I still do today, is I do these things called creative afternoons. And so once a quarter, we'll take every single team member out and we'll go and do something different within the city. So we've been off to the National Gallery, a couple of their free exhibitions. We've walked through the city and looked at some of the famous architecture that makes up the city. And one recently, we actually did a whole bunch of different retail experiences. So everything from Aesop to Uniqlo and in between. The teams were going in to understand what was the way in which the shop induced a kind of positive retail experience. What did it do well? What didn't it do well? Who's the target market? Why is the text on every Aesop bottle so small, but the text on other stuff is so big? What does it inspire? And so we're really then looking for those opportunities to see leaders within other spaces and bring that work back to what we're doing. Because if you think about, say, finance and banking, where I work, they're very commoditized products. And so how do you stand apart and how do you find something that really makes you seem like the premium product and the one that people want to be engaging with, whereas everyone else is the one-off in, say, to use the Aesop example, you're the Aesop and everyone else is in Chemist Warehouse. So how do you get to that point? And so we bring a lot of that approach into the work that we do because we always want to be looking for inspiration elsewhere.
Yeah, no, I love it. And it sounds like you're having some fun there as well. I don't know how many dollars were spent in the Emporium as you're wandering around Uniqlo. Thankfully, it's a cheaper shop anyway, but it's a good thing to do.
We once had a very junior designer. We set him for a shopping experience at Burberry to try and understand what the high-end retail experience was. He came back the next morning and we said, how was it? And he said it was frightfully expensive because he'd gone with his partner and they both then decided to buy something. And he spent about half of his pay packet before he knew what he was doing.
All right. Well, that's a motivation to turn up to work, I guess, if you need to pay for a new habit that's been forged. But that's brilliant. I love the reference to Tim Brown. When I started out in innovation in London, it was one of the first books that was handed to me as well. And there's some really interesting YouTube clips that are now feeling and looking very old now, but the shopping trolley experiments that they were running, and then bringing all this kind of external stimulus, like what would happen if we made it out of this material, and in just the, in pursuit of exploration, just curiosity, pure adventuring around where the thing might take you, with a few random people with white hair and beards and all the things that went with it in a lab environment, just to see what would happen. The stories are all there. I think there's a whole treasure trove of reference points, both in the current context, like you were saying. You can go into the shopping mall, you can find these points of reference, you can talk to people around you, you can observe them in a non-creepy fashion, you can think about how they're interacting with some of these products and services today, and actually learn a lot from that. One of the things that I personally struggled with in my earlier parts of the career was almost looking at what's happening out there in the world and then forging the link between that and what the problem is that I was trying to solve for in the current state. This is a classic because I teach in some of these areas too. They're thinking, well, if all of that's happening, it's physical environment stuff, they're building real products where it's a new shower head or it's a new stair lift or whatever it is. And I'm making this digital app and it's a banking app or it's for super fund. They can't draw the parallels. And actually a lot of what we have to teach in a way, which is the part that's probably the most or the least teachable, is how to make the links between that thing and this thing and that thing and actually bring it into something and actually stripping away not the idea and how it was used over here, but what is the underlying model, the mechanic, what is it about the language, the sensory nature of it, the feeling of it, what is it that you can take from that and actually apply to something else. So do you work in any of those areas, and what do you find tends to work?
It's a fascinating one. You mentioned app. I love this because it comes up where people are like, oh, I need an app for that.
Yeah.
And I love people that use Uber. Uber is a great app. Uber is an amazing service experience. The genius of Uber was to understand that the experience we were having with taxis was atrocious and it needed to be better. And how could we find out that a car was actually going to come? Now, their service levels have dropped off the map at the moment, but let's go back a couple of years at least. But how could we understand when a car was going to arrive? How could we give feedback? How could we actually have a better payments experience? And then, even that idea of how could we also participate potentially as drivers? And this service experience is knitted together then within the app. And so whenever I'm thinking about what we're doing from a digital standpoint, it's always trying to understand what is the member trying to do and how do we enable that. There are really strong parallels between the design for a physical space and the design for a digital space. It's enabling people to do something, to either get from A to B, to interact, to get help, to understand a product. One of the things that we used to do when you would join the team is we would get people to do a design activity. It didn't have to be a big thing, and it was never ever related to our work. I think it's really important that if you're ever asked to do a design activity, it shouldn't be related to the company you're joining because you don't want to give away your work for free. But we used to ask, what would you do to change Flinders Street Station? And it's a really open-ended question, right? So all these people come through Flinders Street Station, what would you do? Because when people are trying to process information under stress, it's an incredibly hard thing to actually take in new information because they're under extreme stress. So you get into Flinders Street Station as a tourist, everything's bombarding you. How do you actually find where you need to go? And so we had some great ideas of people saying, well, you've got to get rid of all the shops because they're in the line of sight. You've got to change the colors on the board. You should be putting lines down that actually marry up with the kind of examples that you've seen in UK hospitals and I think airports. And it's a really wonderful example then into how people think. And so it was a great example for us. It was never about being right, but it was just about how did people approach the problem? Because I think it gives you a good understanding of how will they approach digital design, because digital design is so much harder. Because when you're dealing with the screen real estate of sort of this, right, I'll get it right, like this, how do you show the affordances? How do you show what you can interact with? When you actually get into superannuation, I've got a product that almost every Australian has. I've got a product that many Australians don't care about because they've got to have it so they don't care. And I don't know if you know this, but my most engaged digital members are 65 and over, because they're the ones who are logging in every single day to see what their balance is. So as we're designing digital experiences, it is not the Snapchat and TikTok generation. It is older Australians, and they're likely to have sight impairment or motor control. So we've got to be really accessible in the designs that we're coming up with. It's a really challenging thing to do. And that's where we often look at the physical as a guidance to how we would create those digital experiences.
Yeah, I've worked with both in the built environment and in digital arena similar ones where you're basically observing different demographic. I mean, I think it's a classic around the design team not being the people that they're designing for, and how you forge that gap and how you get the empathy going to the extent that they really feel like they can design for the 65-year-old when you're limited to 6 interviews, which seems to be the magic number. And then you're just talking to these people, you take it all away, you bring it all back to the team, and then you're designing for that. And all of a sudden an app pops out or a new feature. But it's hard to have all of that thrown at you, to absorb it and to really take it through into the design in a meaningful way, I think, particularly when it's not an ongoing conversation. So the relatability of the problem solver to the design challenge to the end user is it's an interesting pyramid to solve for in a way.
It really is. And pensions are a fascinating product because it's the only product I think I've ever come across in my entire career. By its very nature, no one in the team can have one. Because to have one, you've got to be retired. And so it's actually it's been a really difficult product to actually understand. The trick that we did, the approach we took was every single time we're designing or building, we wanted to make sure that it worked for them first. And I think some of my peers have taken the easier route and left them out. And you'll see some of the other superannuation apps, you can't use your pension within their app. And that wasn't something we wanted to do because we wanted to make sure from day one, when we were building our app, when we were building our digital experiences, the questions that we would get were about the product and not about the why can't I see this? Why can't I log into this? Well, because you're not in this group. But I think that the key is honestly, it's research and testing. When I built the team at UniSuper, the very first 2 team members I had were researchers. I then hired some UX designers, but then very quickly hired a person who focused just on research and testing. Because if you're not able to understand what people are thinking about your products, it's going to be very hard to actually go and design them, because otherwise it's all personal bias and assumption. You then want to have a really fast feedback loop as well between the designs that you're creating and what people think about those designs. Because if you can test them and fix them before you're launching, it's a lot cheaper than launching a product that doesn't work and then having to iterate once you've got committed code and it's deployed.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, the point around research and its value, obviously it's practiced with varying levels of skill and maturity in different organizations as well. But you're thinking about the value that's placed on research and empirical evidence in one way or another within an organization. A lot of organizations, from what I see at enterprise level in particular, government, we're thinking about, what exists legacy. There's definitely a school of thought, whether it's said or unsaid, that says that once upon a time we did this thing and we've launched a new product. We tried this thing back then. There's a legacy system. There's a lot of constraint that comes in and a bit of corner cutting, I want to say, where research could come in and actually prove or disprove that point. But actually, there's somebody with a very decent salary and a good title that's coming in and saying, actually, we don't need to go down that route. Let's just kind of carry on as we did. And do you come up against any of that sort of stuff?
The HIPPO, the highest paid person's opinion. I remember years ago, I was leading some service designers, and the service designers were working within a sprint and had been told, you've got to go and do 10 user stories, interviews, whatever it was. And they said, look, we've finished 7, but we've got the really good idea of what we want to do. Can we wrap up here and move on? Because otherwise we're going to run out of time. I told, no, you've got to do your own 10. And they said, well, we might not be able to finish in time. Does that impact on you? And we're told, oh, it doesn't matter. We already know what we want to do, but we just need you to finish the research to prove it. Went,
right.
No, that's not how it works. It goes the other way. I've been shouted at by executives who said, oh, I'm going to present something to the executive leadership team and I've written the paper. Can you just give me the data that supports it? And of course, the data wasn't there because their idea was wrong. And to be shouted at and told, your work is rubbish because you're not across it. Actually, maybe this idea isn't the right idea. Maybe you should be going in a different direction. But it kind of brings back to that point of you run into these things and you allow them to happen if you're not actively nudging the organization in a different direction. So those stories were from when I was much more junior in my career and I was sitting there and waiting to be used by the business. So I've got these skills and capability. I've got these teams. I can go and do this stuff. What do you want me to do? And then when a senior leader sees something or decides what we need is a one-click account opener, we need something else, go and do this thing. You've already lost control. You've lost control because you weren't proactively saying, hey, do you want to grow the number of accounts? What we should be doing is this. Instead, you've let them fixate on an outcome. And now you're potentially worse off than doing nothing because now you've got to undo the bad idea and you've got to introduce the new idea. If you had been in front of them and just introduced the new idea and said, hey, I know that you want to grow accounts. We've got these 2 great ideas. Which ones do you think we should progress? They feel in control and they can go. When you run into those situations, though, and you've not nudged them, I often talk about you want to kind of judo them where you can. So when someone runs in and says, I want to do this thing, so I want to build pink triangle, how quick can we build pink triangles? And pink triangles won't sell, but actually what will sell is something else. Instead of saying pink triangles are a terrible idea, go, absolutely fantastic, let's get on that. But let's also just do some product testing with yellow circles and see whether or not they work as well. And then you can go back and go, listen, we can build these just the way that you want, or we could actually do this slightly different thing, which we think will sell more than 10% more. What do you want to do? And once again, put the decision back in their patch. And sometimes you'll find executives will stick with their thing, but I think most of the time you'll actually find people will shift and adopt new things. So it's all about, I often talk about judoing, which is using their energy to shift them in a different direction.
Yeah, I like it. I wasn't sure which martial art you were going to use, or maybe there was going to be a cat's analogy that came out as well after that point. But it begs an interesting question, I think, for people that aren't in a leadership role, but are again within your team or within a team, and they're feeling like there's a misalignment between what they feel really passionate about and the outcome that either they want to achieve or the leader wants to achieve. That everything's at odds, it feels like. So what would be your advice to people in that situation, and maybe drawing upon some of the things that we were just talking about, but actually making sure that it's not compromised. Everything can be handled at once. In my teaching with students, I'm often talking about this role as an impartial and independent facilitator. So you can say to people, forget the fact that my title says this. I'm actually more interested in bringing the inputs from everybody together. And I'm interested in diversity of perspective that's going to come about as a result of that. And I'll then figure out what it means. And I'll tell you whether your idea was right or wrong after that. But have you got any tips or tricks that you think work in that space?
I think number one, as a leader, you have to create those spaces and you have to invite those conversations. I still distinctly remember the day really early on in my career, getting an email from my boss saying, how could I be a better leader? And inviting the feedback, inviting that. So as a leader, you've got to create the space. Now, as a person who's not a leader, if your leader's created the space, that makes it a lot easier. But if they haven't, you've got to engage in the courageous conversation. You've got to actually step up and say, this is what we should be doing, or giving the feedback. I think the trick is, once again, eat your own cake. Use design to understand what's the person you're dealing with. What are their drivers? What are their needs and their wants? Do that kind of empathy map for your leader in your head and work out what are your points of leverage or your points of influence, and lean into those. If your leader's particularly focused on, I'll pick an example. If your leader's particularly focused on cutting cost as an example and desperately wants to do that, your idea is going to blow the budget out by an extra $2 or $3 million. Maybe that's not the moment. Maybe it's more about understanding where they want. Can your idea pivot and help achieve that outcome? Can you align with where they're going? But also even learn their rhythm. Understand where are they best likely to actually accept feedback or accept information. Is it Monday morning? Is it Friday afternoon? Use them and actually look at what's the best time to be able to give that feedback, and then step up and lean in. I've never, ever regretted in my career having the courageous conversation. What I've often regretted is not being bolder sooner.
I mean, I could ask you about where that happened, but maybe it's a secret.
Again and again, to be honest, again and again. I'd shared earlier that I'd delivered work at Telstra and then been made redundant. Honestly, it was the disconnection between my leader and me, that I wasn't having those conversations and I wasn't really understanding what they truly wanted. And they were a bit frustrated because they felt I wasn't listening. And sometimes having the courageous conversation creates an opportunity for two-way feedback. Otherwise, it can become a bit stilted and things can fester and problems can become worse than they need to be. And all of a sudden, you're out on your ear.
Yeah, I mean, the misalignment is often there, isn't it? And it's often unspoken about, where you think you're both great and actually it's review time, and that doesn't seem to be the case. But anyway, I want to ask you a question that's slightly unrelated to what we've just been talking about, but you strike me as somebody who's really comfortable in not only these sorts of conversations where it could go anywhere, right? But I want to just figure out whether within the time that you've had within these organizations, the conversations, it feels like it's this notion of being caught out, right? You're always saying you've got your design in your back pocket, you've got a story to tell. What do you do in the situations where questions are being asked of you that you really don't feel you can answer either adequately, or you're just feeling a little bit uncertain about it because it's unexpected, just totally out of the blue?
Oh, you've got to be completely honest. You have to be completely honest. I think the thing that I've learned over the years is that senior people get into roles and they have a waffle detector. It's the ability to determine really quickly whether or not you know what you're talking about or not. And early in my career, I thought what you had to do was you had to fill the space. So, Brendan, what are you doing here? And instead of saying, I actually forgot about that, I haven't done the thing, I can do that this week because I've got a gap in my calendar, I would start giving excuses, or I'd say, well, we've actually been looking at it and it's more complex than we thought. And they know that you're not telling the truth and you're not actually saving yourself, you're diminishing yourself and you're diminishing the work of your team. So I really quickly will put my hand up and say, I don't know, and then set a time frame for when I can come back. It kind of plays into this idea as well about honesty and failure. And I think this is a really important one. I will throw my hand up very quickly if we've done something that hasn't worked and said, you know what, we actually mucked this one up. We could have gone better. We should have done this thing over here. This is definitely our learning. This is what we'll be doing for next time. Because actually acknowledging fault and failure, while we might talk a lot about it, we're going to fail fast. I don't think it's something that we actually do very well. And so as a leader and as a designer, having a reputation for being truthful is, once again, it's really incredible because it means that's your foundation. That's the lens that people view you through. You've got this wonderful opportunity to then be building on that with the work that you're producing, the other stuff that you're doing. It's viewed through that lens of, well, Chris is always telling us the truth. Let's have a listen to this, as opposed to, gosh, Chris is always waffling. He's always filling the space. Is this yet another one of those, or is it something that we should be listening to?
I also love the waffle detector, which I think is made after you're the waffle maker first, and then you turn into the waffle detector because you've had to waffle a bit through your time, and then you can eventually spot it a mile off. But it just made me reflect on the perception of leadership, and I guess the conventional archetypes that you do see. They still exist in the world of work today, obviously, but where there was an alpha lead, probably a white male, and you're just seeing that they've got to the top by being that sort of no bullshit kind of character and just telling the truth. I mean, maybe there's something to learn from that. A lot of people would just recoil now because it's an outdated version of leadership, but actually transparency, what's at the heart of it, is still probably good intent, even if you can puck the ego, the bravado and all the other things that probably went with it as well. But actually the intent is that we're communicating clearly and I'm telling you exactly what you want and you're hearing it, and hopefully we can get to an understanding. But obviously that's something that it's gone about the wrong way a lot of the time as well. So it just made me think of that.
No, it's very true. It's very true. I think about that idea of, as leaders, the idea of leadership has definitely evolved. I had some shocking leaders early in my career who were that very authoritarian, bang the table, lots of swearing. And I don't have that as part of my toolkit. I think the idea of getting angry at work is just weird. I'm much more likely to do the disappointed dad as opposed to the angry boss. But you should never ever shy away from being clear with people, because I think bad leadership can ruin careers. Because if you're not clear with people and you're not giving them the feedback and the opportunity to grow, you're actually undermining them and you're really not helping them learn what they need to do to get better. It doesn't mean that you're rude. It doesn't mean that you're belittling. You should never ever make people feel small, but you should always be really clear in what you're doing. I think the other aspect of that is you've got to own your own behavior. I've said sorry to my teams more time than I can possibly count, where I'll get something wrong or I'll do something wrong or I'll make the wrong point and then circle back and go, you know what, Chris, I did this thing. I absolutely shouldn't have done that. I'll do better next time. I'm sorry. And mean it. I think that creates that opportunity as a leader where you can be trusted and empowered by your team to go and do the things they need you to do.
Yeah, I mean, it's so valuable. I think we might just need to end there because I feel like we could go to even bigger and deeper points, or we could go to something that's maybe smaller and just a bit funny to talk about. But I feel like that's a great place to end the interview, and I really appreciate your time today, Brendan. Thank you so much. And I know the people that have both worked with you and somebody that we both know is in your team right now. And it's interesting to hear from different points of view. And I think the sum of the parts is that you're a really great leader in these areas, and for the reasons that you've described in the interview today. So it was really a privilege to hear that firsthand today. And I know that the listeners of the show will get a lot from it as well. So thank you.
Thank you very much for the invitation today, Chris.
Okay, so that's it for this episode. If you're hearing this message, you've listened all the way to the end. So thank you very much. We hope you enjoyed the show. We'd love to hear your feedback, so please leave us a review and share this episode with your friends, team members, leaders, if you think it'll make a difference. After all, we're trying to help you, the entrepreneurs, kick more goals within your organizations. If you have any questions about the things we covered in the show, please email me directly at chris@companyroad.co. I answer all messages, so please don't hesitate to reach out. And to hear about the latest episodes and updates, please head to companyroad.co to subscribe. Tune in next Wednesday for another new episode.